In this How-To-Svelte, we're going to build a quote rotator. If we head on over to W3 Schools, their How-To section, they have a quotes slideshow, and I'm sure you're very familiar with this. It's going to be a bunch of quotes that we can cycle through with some forward and back arrows, as well as some dots to keep track of which quote we're on. And in addition to this, we'll also add a switch that will allow us to autoplay the quote slideshow. So if I click that on after 5 seconds, the quote will automatically go to the very next slide. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll go back to W3 Schools and we'll grab all of their HTML and CSS and bring it over to the Svelte REPL. Okay, so we have the HTML and CSS in, and you can see something showing up over here, but we can't see the quote yet. And if we go into the CSS, we'll notice that My Slides has got a display property of none. So if we bring that to block, you can see the 3 quotes that we have in the HTML show up. Now, if we come up to the HTML, these are the elements making each of the quotes. And because of their symmetry, it already suggests to us that this should be a component. So let's right off the bat go ahead and make a quote component. And then let's go ahead and import the quote component into app. And then down here in the HTML where the quotes are, we'll go ahead and just take all these out and replace them with the component that we made. And we can only see one quote now because the quote component has hard-coded values in right now, but we'll replace that with some data. So next what we'll do is we'll add a data import here, and we'll call it quote data.js. And so I put together some quotes, and it's an array of objects, and each object has a quote, which is a string, and then the author, which is also a string. And what we'll do is we'll export this and then import this array into app. Okay, the next thing we want to do is we want to deal with props. So in order for us to actually see the data that's coming from our quote data.js file, let's go ahead and make some properties here. We'll call this quote, and we're using Svelte syntax to wrap that in. And then here we'll call this author. I'm going to replace this dash with a M dash. And then what we'll do is we'll export quote and export author. Now these are undefined now, but we'll go define them in a minute. Let's head up to our parent component app. And here in the parent component, we'll create a variable of the same name, and we'll make that equal to quotes. And we'll do the quote in the first index. That's this one right here. So that's why we have the 0. And we'll get the property quote. So remember, the quote is here, and the key for this is author. Okay, now we can go ahead and finish the piping into this quote component here. So now we can do quote, because this component, because this variable name is the same as this variable name, we can just use this shorthand of curly brace, quote, curly brace, and we'll do the same with author. Okay, so we have basically zeroed in on the very first quote in our quote data, and we got it showing up here. Now let's go ahead and add another variable which will represent this number here, which is the index. And we'll call this quote index, and we'll set it to 0. And so we'll replace this number with this variable. And then the reason we're going to do it this way is we're going to use these arrows to advance to the next quote or go to the previous quote. And so these arrows are more or less just going to control this number. When I go to the next, it'll go up to 1. If I go to previous, it goes back down to 0. So let's set up some on clicks on our arrows, which you can see with the vanilla JavaScript code, it's already there. And we'll replace this with some Svelte syntax, and we'll call this event handler previous quote. And we'll do the same for this arrow. We'll call this one next quote. And you can see our error messages are saying, hey, these aren't defined yet. So let's go ahead and go to our script tags and define these. Okay, so in a nutshell, what previous quote event handler is going to do is it's going to take quote index. Previous quote is going to decrement it by 1. And then next quote will take quote index and increment it by 1. So now even with just this, let's see what happens. And so I think with that error, what we're going to do is we're actually going to just remove this from being an anchor tag. Let's just make these span tags. That way they don't actually activate any default elements of the browser. So now that they're span, let's see what happens. Okay, so we're clicking on it. Let's just make sure that the quote index is advancing. So we'll do a reactive console log. This reactive part here is something Svelte offers. And as soon as we click this arrow, yes, it is advancing. And this one is going back. So they are working. But the problem is that these variables here, quote and author, you can see they're relying on this variable here, quote index. And so they're not updating as this updates. And the way we can do that in Svelte is by also making these variables reactive. And so all we have to do is add $, and now they become reactive variables. And so now when I click this, this increments and this updates. It's much like a spreadsheet where certain parts of the spreadsheet are dependent on other cells. Some cells are dependent on other cells. So these variables are dependent on this. So by making them reactive, we allow the DOM to reflect the most present state. Now, as you can see, these arrows are incrementing this quote index. I just want to also say that we've got similar things on the slideshow gallery for How-To-Svelte, as well as the flip card effect with flashcards. So check these 2 videos out as well. This would be good further practice with this same kind of pattern where we take some arrows and increment a number, and that number helps control which object in the array we're seeing. So the next thing we need to do in our event handlers is handle the edge cases. So you can see we're on number 2. If I keep going down, now I'm on number 1. So if I click the next one, 0, but now I should go from 0 here and then recycle back to the end again. Likewise, if I'm on the last quote, if I click the next arrow, it should cycle back up to the first quote. So let's handle that real quick. Okay, so now if we hit we're on quote 0, if we hit the previous arrow, it should take us back to the end of the array. And so now we're at the end of the array, so if we hit the next arrow, it should take us to the first quote in the array. So good, so we got our event handlers working. Now let's go ahead and work on these dots here. If we come down to the HTML, again, we can see that this could be a component. So let's go ahead and just grab one of these and we'll make a dot component. Then we'll import dot into app. And then we'll replace these 3 span elements with the dot component. Good, so we got one showing up. And so what we want is we want one dot to represent each of these quotes. And so let's set up a loop. This is a Svelte each loop. And normally we could use this array here to make these dots, but we're not really going to use any of this data inside our dots. That data is actually for up here. So what we could do is we could just make an array using the array object, and its length will be the length of this quote data array, and we'll just give a generic underscore. Good. So, this is just another way to do it. This array has a length, but it doesn't actually have values for each index. But that's all right. We just needed something generic to render out a dot for each of the quotes in here. Now, if we were using this data here, it would make more sense to then make this each loop. It would be like each quotes as quote. But that's all right. This is just a generic way to do this. And it's now set up. Let's work on setting up selecting the dot for the quote that is showing. And you can see there's a class here called active. And if we add that here, you can see the dots change their appearance. So let's add another class, and we'll add the class active when whatever's in here evaluates to true. So let's create a couple variables here. We'll call this quote index. And we need a counter of sorts. And what we basically want to say is, add this active class to the dot when the quote index is equal to the counter. And you might be asking yourself, well, how do we do this? How do we determine these? So quote index, let's go ahead and export these so we can build that piping to the parent component. And quote index, if we come down here to our dots, this quote index will be the value of this quote index. So we've made a piping from the parent to the dot. So whenever this changes, that value will go over to dot. But the other value we need to go up to the parent is this counter. So where's that going to come from? Luckily, inside this loop, there is an index counter of sorts. So we can also just say counter equals I. And as soon as I do that, you can see just this one has the class active added to it. And so if I go to the next quote, then the next dot gets added, the class active. Now if we head back to dot, let's clean this up a little bit. You can see we have an on-click event listener. So let's go ahead and use that. And what we're going to do is just forward this event. So we're just going to do on::click. There's nothing else to do here. We'll forward that up to the parent component. And inside of dot, let's go ahead and define the event handler. And basically what we want to say is that when we click on this dot, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, when we click on this dot, which has an index of 5, we want to set the quote index to 5. So let's just say on::click. We'll use an anonymous function, and we'll set quote index to be I. This is the index. Kind of an index counter. Okay, so that should be all we need. So if I click on this, it goes to that quote. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is clean up the HTML and CSS a little bit. I think I'll add some main tags and tuck all of this stuff in there. Also clean up the CSS for the quote component, just change a few things. Okay, good. So that just cleaned up the CSS a little bit and styled it a little bit more the way I want to see it. But the functionality is the same. And it looks like we more or less have our quote rotator working on a very basic level. Next thing we'll do is we'll add this autoplay feature. So let's head on over to W3 Schools and we'll grab one of these switches. If you go to their how-to section, look up toggle switch, and we'll grab this round one here. And then in our Svelte REPL, I'll go ahead and create another component called autoplay button. Okay, and then we'll also copy this and import it into app. And then down in the HTML, let's tuck this in just after the each loop, but before the ending div here. And so good, we can see it show up here. It's going to tweak the CSS a little bit. And I'm also going to add some section tags. Okay, so that cleans it up a little bit. And you can see when I hover over it, I've got this tag that shows up. And what that is I added this section tag here, but we can also use a pseudo element, and that's what this after is. And so I added it to when I hover over the section, we can use the after pseudo element to then add some content. And I went ahead and styled it a little bit. Now, this still doesn't have any functionality yet, so let's work on that. The first thing we want to deal with any input in Svelte is most likely the bind directive. So we're going to bind checked. That means this input of type checkbox, we want to bind its value to a variable that we'll make called switch on. And we'll put that up here. Let's switch on. And we'll take this up to the parent container, which is why we exported it. And in the script tag, let's make a comment here. This will be for autoplay. And so we'll set switch on to false. And we'll also reactively console log this value just so you can see. So now false shows. Now if I switch it on, we have to actually pass this now into our autoplay. So we'll bind to switch on. And now we should be able to see it in the console. So now the checkbox is checked. And if I click it again, the checkbox is unchecked. Now you might be thinking, well, where's the checkbox? I can't see it. Well, that just has to do with the CSS. They've basically taken a checkbox and hidden it and instead styled a span tag. That's what this is. They've made this invisible and they've styled this, but the functionality is the same. The checkbox is still there. It's just hidden. And so when you click here, the checkbox is checked and the value that comes back is true. And that now unchecked comes back as false. So the next thing we want to do on this input is when this switch gets clicked, we'll use an onChange event listener and we'll forward that up to the app component. And let's go ahead and make that here. And we'll call the event handler handle auto advance. So it's going to automatically advance the slides. So let's go ahead and create that handler. And we want to basically base this function off of this Boolean. So let's start it by saying if switch on is true, then go ahead and we'll set an interval function here. And the set interval function will continually call another function every X amount of time that we indicate. So let's call the next quote function. And we'll call it every 2,000 milliseconds. So that'll be every 2 seconds, which is kind of fast, but it'll just show us what's going on. So now if I click this, let's see what happens. Okay, so it is working. The set interval is working. But the thing is if we go back to false again, it doesn't stop. And so now we need to set up a few more details in order to control this. What we'll do is we'll set up another variable called auto-advance. And the reason we're setting this up is we're actually going to assign it to set interval. And the reason is that way we can clear it. So we'll make an else block here and we'll clear interval auto-advance. So this allows us to turn on the slideshow, and then when we turn it back to false again, this clear interval will stop the slideshow. So let's try that. Now slideshow's off and it freezes. So the clear interval removed auto-advanced. So now the one thing that is a problem, our potential problem, is when we turn on the autoplay, these are still active. And so a person can still click around, but the set interval is still running every 2 seconds. Even when I click the forward and back. So it's not really allowing us to enjoy the quote. So one idea is what we can do is we can just maybe make all of these not clickable while this is in autoplay mode. And so what we'll do is we'll do that using CSS. Let's come over to our dot. And at the bottom of our CSS, let's create a class that we'll call not clickable. And we'll use a property called pointer events. And one of its values can be none. So what we'll do is we'll add this class to these dots. We'll add this class to these dots when some value is true. So again, let's go ahead and make another variable, which we'll export, called autoplaying. So let's move that up to app. And we'll set autoplaying to false. And we'll need to pass that value to the dot component here. So we'll say autoplaying like that. So once this value is established, it'll pass it over the dot. And if it's true, which when the show is on, it should be true. And when the show is off, it should be false. And then we have to make sure to put this in the curly braces here. That way the value gets there. Okay, so now if we turn the show on, see, we're not able to click these dots at all. And you just saw it auto-advanced. It's advancing every 4 seconds, but I can't click any of these dots. And that's because this class here with pointer events set to none is actually added to all the dots. Now if I turn the show off, now autoplaying is false, and now I can go back to using the dots. In fact, you can see the cursor change to a pointer. So that we just want to do the same thing also to this advance to the next and previous arrows. So let's do the same thing. We'll just copy this not clickable CSS rule. And we want to add that to these span tags, which are the arrows. And we want to add the not clickable class when autoplaying is true. We can literally copy and paste this. Okay, we'll try it again. So I'll turn on autoplay. And you can see the pointer disappears, and these are no longer clickable, as well as the dots. But the autoplay still goes. If I turn it off, the autoplay, then I get my pointer back, and then I can use the arrows as well as the dots. Then the last thing I want to do is, right now the quote is just quickly going to the next one. There's no real transition. And that's because we're not actually replacing this quote div with a new div. All we're doing is replacing the values inside of these p tags and the q tag here. But what we can do is Svelte offers something called key. And we can use that with our quote here, hashtag key. And when some value changes each time, then re-render the component. And the one thing that's changing each time is the quote. If we come up here and look at this quote here, so we'll just base it off that. So every time quote changes, then re-render this component. And now what does that allow us to do? It actually allows us to have a smooth transition, and Svelte provides some transitions out of the box. So let's go over to quote, and I'm going to import fade. And so now we can come down here to the div and add a transition directive, and we'll fade it. And this will only work when the component is actually being replaced and re-rendered. And that's why we're actually using this key. So Svelte will automatically help replace that div element each time. So now if we do it, okay, good. So now we're starting to get a nice fade in and out. Whereas before, without that transition, if I go back to quote and I remove this, you can see the transition is sudden. But if I add that back in, then it's much smoother. And I can even add some things like duration. Maybe we want the duration to be 2,000 milliseconds. So let's see. Which is too slow, but you get the idea. Maybe we make it 500. So now even on the autoplay, and that's pretty much everything. So that's how you can do a quote rotator using Svelte, and a little bit of the HTML and CSS from W3 Schools.